I'm just going to introduce this with a little tiny story. My house caught on fire yesterday, and it was actually a really terrible fire. And I'm not kidding, that the first thought I had was, because I was away from the house when I found out that this happened, was, oh my gosh, my notes from Amy's memoir are going to burn, and I'm going to make a fool of myself here. But in the 24 hours since that happened, I have also realized that spending so much time with her recent memoir over the past week actually served as kind of preparation for the upheaval that I just went through. Your book is...
In what way?
Well, your book is...
I said to her, why are you here? Your house just burned down.
Your book is filled with, with your revelations about upheavals you've undergone, upheavals your mother and grandmother and father underwent, and it's also a very brave and vulnerable revelation about process. You wrote it swiftly. It's filled with private email correspondence, with letters that are private, with very private bits of writing not necessarily meant for the public. So I thought we could start with, I'm just going to read one or two lines that I found to be very provocative from the memoir. You say, I am not the subject matter of mothers and daughters, or Chinese culture, or immigrant experience that most people cite as my domain. I am a writer compelled by a subconscious neediness to know. Can you tell us more about this neediness to know and really what you're searching for in writing?
Well, I think, the mistake a lot of people make is that I'm an expert on the things that I write about, these subjects like mothers and daughter. And really, I'm more confused and obsessed. I think confusion does bring me closer to obsession, where I need to know something because it has to do with the meaning of my life. And why am I here, and who am I, and what's important? If I did not focus on those questions, I can go off and have a grand life, but really not anything in the way of a pattern. And I'm looking for the pattern. Mm-hmm. So writing helps me to do that because it coalesces experience and memory and curiosity as well as thoughts and ideas. And they all go into one big mishmash, and eventually with enough revision and an editor who demands it be turned in, it becomes a novel.
You talk about patterns in the book. You also talk about misperception, misinterpretation, about the inevitability of your own misinterpretation, let's say, of your past, from your early youth or your parents' past. You also talk about the inevitability of your readers' misinterpretation of your work. Yeah. What do you feel people misunderstand? Can you comment on that, or is it too hard to characterize?
Well, I think that everybody is in the position to misunderstand everybody else. I mean, how can anybody understand you if they have not lived your experience, your childhood, and the humiliations you've gone through, so that when you simply see their successes, you don't know all the backdrop behind that. And so I accept that no one's ever going to understand why I wrote a particular book. I thought I would come closer in writing this book, this memoir, about, it's really a book about writing and how I write and think. It's a book about thinking, imagining, about how I remember and what I remember. I thought I'd get closer to having people understand that, but I didn't. And I said to myself, that's okay. That's how it's always going to be. I was, in fact, afraid that people were going to read this and understand me better, and it was private, and I didn't want them to understand, and they don't. So, so I'm safe. You can read it, and you don't really know me. All the things that are really bothersome to me about who I am as a human being. People don't actually see that, which is nice.
Well, it is such a book about process, and you reveal, again, in a really vulnerable, honest way, I think, in a very brave way, some of the ways that you gain access to that imaginative process. So music, you write about music. That's one of the ways, how you listen to classical music to, you say, to which acts as a purgative in clearing my mind of cluttered thoughts. Can you, I don't know, tell us a little bit perhaps, or speak about the value of that liberation from cluttered thoughts and maybe even coherent structures of thought?
You know, you said that I was brave in writing this book, and I wasn't really brave. I was more like, I was more naive than anything, because I was writing this spontaneously, a chapter a week, and you really cannot write anything coherent or carefully edited in a week like that. But I found that the spontaneity of the writing forced me to be a little bit more free with actual thoughts and these patterns I have in my life. So that did come out in the book. These, the spontaneity and of that also weaves its way into the kind of metaphors that I have. So, yeah, I don't know whether that answered your question, but I just wanted to say I wasn't brave, I was stupid, actually, and how I wrote this book. And it was my editor, Dan, who started to think that this was a memoir instead of a book about writing. As I was turning these things in, he kept nudging me toward continue, send me this once a week, because he saw that this was coming out unedited. You know, like a purgative. Right. But once it was out, I wished that I could take it back in again. It was like vomiting, you know, and you look at it and then you say, well, better clean this up so nobody else looks at it.
Well, an example of the kind of material that you include that I think is very private, and that's why I think it's brave, I'm going to stand by that, was inspired by a piece of music, Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 3, and it's you record the imaginative vision, really, that you have while listening to this. And it's a story, just to kind of summarize quickly, of a young woman who is very alone and yearning for love, yearning for connection, and finds that she thinks with this man in a wordless kind of fusion with him, and as time goes by, realizes maybe she was just projecting that onto him. Maybe, in fact, he was using her. That seems to be representative of a pattern that emerges also in the book, of women who are yearning for belonging, who feel alone, who are abused by men or left by them, and who betray as a consequence. I wonder if you want to talk about these patterns.
Well, I think it's first of all, it's the theme of Madame Bovary. It's the theme of Anna Karenina. It's the theme of many novels, but it's the theme of a lot of women of a particular place and time who were subjugated, as my grandmother and my mother were, and have had their life determined by circumstances they didn't choose. When I listen to music, though, it's almost as though the subconscious takes over and these stories come up, and they could be cliched stories. I'm not saying that they're wonderful stories, but I see the images, I see it, and I think it's almost, it was influenced a lot by watching movies like Fantasia that had great music, but also stories that were unfolding at the same time. I asked my friends, and I asked some people one time, I said, how do you also see stories, when you're listening to music, do you see stories unfolding? I mean, do you, when you're listening to classical music, do you see a story happening in front of you? Raise your hand. So some of you do. But when I found out that it wasn't really the case for a lot of people, I was shocked. It was like finding out that people didn't see the story that they were reading. So that's another question. When you read a story, do you see it like in your head? Do you see it happening? Or do you understand it mentally? I mean, do you see the story? Okay, so you see the story. It's the same thing that I felt about the music. And I think that what that is another, we have these different forms and senses that release images that we have within us and memories, and they come out in these vehicles, whether it's music or art, or your own imagination when you're sitting down and playing and you have a deadline and you have to come up with a story.
And these
That's the worst process, actually.
Do you think that a lot of these images are archetypes, and is that part of why you're attracted to fairy tales? And I mean, I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but you mentioned this possibility of universal consciousness.
I think that there are archetypes for many different reasons. One of them is cultural. We're raised in a particular time and place, and we are all undergoing this experience under this present president. So we have archetypes that are being developed in our minds. And so there are ones that we share. And then there are these ones that are the universal consciousness that I think has to do with our ongoing humanity as well, and not just some spooky, unknown ethereal entity. But I also allow that there's a spooky ethereal entity that we don't understand. I like that possibility. It's one that my mother ingrained in me from the time I was a little girl. But I think it's more not to simply believe in the unbelievable, but to ask myself, why would I believe that? So one of the possibilities is we can't know, and that this is just out there. Love being part of that universal consciousness.
You reveal in the memoir having gone through a terrible car accident. You were studying linguistics at the time, so language was your...
No, that was a fiction.
Oh, that was a fiction?
No,
okay, because I was just going to say it read like a fable to me with a fox.
It was
and
a
I was
fable.
going to ask you about
this
that.
was a mistake. Okay, if you actually read this book, I am not brain damaged. Okay, I am brain damaged because I had Lyme disease, but I'm not brain damaged because of a car accident. I was in a terrible car accident, but it wasn't that one. What they forgot to put in this book was, on the title, it was supposed to say, an outtake from an abandoned novel. And there are 2 chapters in there that are that. The prologue, which is the breaker of combs. That is an outtake. That's an abandoned novel. And then the other one was this thing called Language, a Love Story. So I was kind of shocked. You're not the only one who believed that. I mean, the New York Times reporter thought it was true, the Washington Post, and I was horrified.
Because I had never seen it written about before.
Mostly because the narrator of that story is kind of wacky and really a snob and very, odd about language. I mean, she lies in bed with these lovers that are speaking dead languages, so that's not me.
That did seem
okay.
odd.
I have my husband in bed and a book, okay, English.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to mention it seemed very fable-like, but to return to the Breaker of Combs, which I did know was an outtake, this is a fairy tale, really kind of created, a fairy tale, let's say, about grief, about a daughter's grief, a daughter whose mother has killed herself, hung herself with her own hair. And it evokes the suicides in your own familial, past. Your grandmother's suicide when your mother was 9. Mm-hmm. The betrayal your mother must have felt, the pain. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You also experienced pain when you were 9. Here I'm trying to call up the patterns. I was noticing the patterns.
Yeah.
When you returned home with your father from church to find that your mother had overturned the living room furniture and thrown your birthday cake on the floor. Yeah. Now I'm thinking everything is made up. Was that true?
No. The other parts are true. The incidents, yes, are based on my life. My grandmother killed herself. She took an overdose of opium, and there are many different theories as to why she did that. my mother as a child would like to believe that her mother would not have deliberately left her. So her version is that her mother was angry. She'd been forced to be a concubine. She didn't get the house that she wanted. And she killed her. She died accidentally. She took an overdose of opium just meant to scare the man, but ended up dying. And then there are other people who said it was deliberate. No matter what it was, when you're a little girl who watches your mother dying, leaving you over the couple of days' time, you wind up damaged. And that was my mother, a damaged woman who was left permanently suicidal. Mm-hmm. I grew up with a mother who dealt with crises, any kind of personal disturbance in her mind with the idea she could get rid of these problems by killing herself or going to China. Mm-hmm. And from being the time I was a little girl, I just remember this was always an option there, and it frightened me. Mm-hmm. It frightened my brothers. And there were enough times that she attempted it that we could never say she was faking it. We always quaked, even when we were adults. When my mother died at age 84 and quite happy, my brother and I were by her side, and after 20 minutes of crying, I turned to him and I said, she didn't kill herself. And only he and I could understand why that was such a victory for us as kids, and now as adults.
Yeah,
But the pattern is there. The pattern was established in my mother as her being suicidal, and the pattern was established as me as in these suicidal images or these stories, which really have to do with abandonment and what that means. Abandonment of love. I mean, how can you leave somebody you love by killing yourself? So, there's more there than simply, killing oneself, and that's the end of your existence. What happens as the aftermath for generations.
And that sense of kind of being, of each generation reenacting in some sense the trauma of the generation before. In some ways it seems like, I wonder if you sort of escaped that fate or the vicissitudes of your mother and grandmother by consigning those repetitions to your writing itself. Does it feel like that? Or
I don't know whether I would have felt more desperate or suicidal or self-destructive if I hadn't been writing. Mm-hmm. I think that I would have been okay. I'm not somebody who thinks of suicide as an answer to solving problems in life. But I think that's true also when I think about my father. My father was a very devout Christian, for example. He was an evangelist. Billy Graham was his hero. We grew up with Billy Graham sermons and thinking, the next Billy Graham movie came out and we had to go. Well, that did not imprint itself on me, and it didn't make me an evangelist, for example. But it gave me a backdrop, a context for how I look at my life and how I interpret and take all the patterns that are coming to me. And see it also through that background of a mother who felt that she was tied to her past and the suicide of her mother, and a father who thought, heaven lay in the future for all of us as long as we followed the word of the Bible.
Maybe we can talk for just a minute about...
By the way, I met Billy Graham.
You did? What was that like?
Well, he was an icon. I was at the White House, not to brag, but I've been to the White House like 5 times, but not to brag. One of those occasions, I was seated next to Reverend Billy Graham, and I said, "Mr. Reverend Graham, my father, you were his idol," and on and on and on, and he just looked at me kind of grumpily and went, like that. Oh. And then when we had to stand, when they did the presidential theme music, da 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 da, and President Clinton came in and everybody was standing, he was having a hard time, and I tried to help him, and he went like that. Oh. And so I thought, my God, he's a grumpy old man. And I had these images of him, this notion of him as this wonderful hero of our family. And I hadn't thought of him as a hero for a long time, but I thought he was kind of closer to being saint-like than a grumpy old man. So that was my...
Maybe this is a good moment then to depart for a minute about the track I was going to go down and talk instead about. You've been at the White House 5 times. You're a public persona. You have in a way almost a responsibility to this persona, and yet you write in the book, I am intermittently aghast that everything I have written will actually be an open book, and my stomach lurches at the thought of public scrutiny. There's an insistence on, it feels very authentic, of, that you're writing to discover something about yourself, and it's a private act, and yet it's a public act. So do you want to talk about...
It's contradictory, and the impulse of the actual writing comes out of that need to know, the neediness to know, the curiosity, the desire to find the pattern. And then when you get to revision, that's when it's going to be published. So it's a dual, mind that is going on when I'm doing the writing. When I'm done and I know that it's going to be published, then I have a crisis, an existential crisis of, here's this bit of me that's going to go out in the world, and it's gone. It's lost. It's in the hands of other people, and I can't take it back. I can't revise it. I can't make it any better, and that's going to be the record of that. Writing this book made me realize how uncomfortable I am with that notion of being interpreted based on extant materials that are left, whether it's published or left in a garage somewhere. And I made a very big decision that I'd been wrestling over for years, which is, what do you do with your so-called papers, your archives? I've had libraries who've offered to house these things, or even pay me quite handsomely for the papers. Mm-hmm. What they actually want is the dirt, the worst things that you would never want to reveal. Bad drafts, but also letters to friends who are confessing they had affairs or whatever. And they want it all. And I thought, this is private. Mm-hmm. For one thing, I can't share somebody else's letters. So I decided that I'm going to burn it all. I'm not going to share it. And it was such a relief to me. It was such freedom to know I could write in my journals. I could keep these mementos for myself, because I am like Hansel and Gretel, leaving crumbs behind. I want to find the crumbs and go back again, but I don't want anybody else to see it. So I made the decision that I'm not going to burn it. I'm going to shred it.
Why shred instead of burn?
Environment.
Okay. That makes sense.
But I have the instructions. I have this woman, and it's written down, and she already had. You can call these trucks, and they'll come by in front of your house, and they park there, and they're like giant shredders. And then, I don't know, you could probably do furniture. You could do anything. You throw the boxes in there, and you witness it being destroyed. And so you have the knowledge. You didn't throw it in the garbage, and somebody went and picked it out and did something with it. So that's what's going to happen.
You were telling me...
Except the photos.
Okay.
Because it's not superstitious exactly, but I feel the images belong to other people, and it just seems a little weird to shred other people's images. Mm-hmm. So, except for those that I don't like anymore, then I can do. I have ripped up photos of people I will never have anything to do with in the future. I just found one the other day.
And yet you write that it's
I'm
impossible.
not a nice person. A lot of people think, oh, she's so nice. She with the Joylet Club, mother and daughter. No, I'm not. In many ways, I'm very nasty, and I say bad words, and I can be mean, but kind. Yeah.
Now I'm nervous.
Yeah.
Back there in the green room area, you were saying that writing this book kind of made you realize that you want to reclaim. These are my words, not yours, but the gist of it was you want to reclaim something of yourself, I think, and
Yeah.
freedom
Yeah.
to write for yourself.
Well, when I wrote the book, there were a number of chapters where the notion of expectations came up. There was one that had to do with being a genius. My parents decided that I was a genius, and I just had to work harder to become one. It was like a muscle, you know. It's like personal training, and then you become a genius. So I lived with that expectation, on top of the fact that my older brother was a genius, and that the expectation of playing the piano. When I was writing this, all of the feelings I had of these expectations and failing them came up, not as a woman who's 65 years old, but as a kid who was 6 years old and really resented having the expectations, because it was not only the burden, it was the idea that no one really saw you. No one really understood you. And I think that this lack of understanding, this feeling that you're not understood, is the impetus for a lot of artists and writers, that we want to create something that is our own, where, the whole universe, the cosmology of who we are contained in this piece of work. So I wanted to get rid of these, I realized I'm 6 years old again in that story, and I want to get rid of the expectations. And now I can as an adult, because I've finished writing these books. I've got enough for my obituary, I don't have to get any more awards or anything like that. I have one more book I have to complete on contract, and then I'm not going to do books on contract anymore. I'm not going to have the expectations. I will continue to write. I will continue to do these things, but for myself. And that was another liberating thing that I got out of doing this book, which, the feeling that I had with the book is that it was such a necessary thing for me to do, and that I hated having it published. But ultimately, glad, because I had these insights on what was important to me. So that was one, just get rid of the expectations.
You hated having it published because you felt more vulnerable because it was written more quickly?
Well, both those things. I would have revised this book a number of times, but my publisher, who fell in love with this book, I think he sees it as his book as well, which it is, because he just kept coercing me to get more and more out. A book a week, and we had this pact, which is he couldn't say anything about the book. He couldn't say anything good about the book that was coming out, and he could only say something bad if he really thought that I was going off track somewhere, and writing a book about Istanbul when I was supposed to be writing about writing. So that was the only conditions, but I could see that he was taking this on almost like a mission. And so he loves this book. I see its flaws, and I see where I allowed myself to be very vulnerable. In the moment, discovering things that were very painful. For example, that I was not my father's favorite. If you grew up thinking that, and you're writing something and you realize you're looking at the mementos, you're pulling things out of these boxes, and you realize you weren't the favorite, or you realize they lied to you about the reason why you took a test every year, that it was not because you were smart enough to be a doctor. Mm-hmm. It had a completely different purpose. So these discoveries were happening at the same time that I was writing the book, coming out so fresh. They were devastating. And now I was turning over these devastating discoveries to my editor, who I love dearly, but, still, he's a guy, and turned it over to him, and then he's going to hand it out to other people. Mm-hmm. So, but then it turns out nobody really understands the book anyway, so go ahead and read it.
I want to return I know I asked you before about the subject of how are you misunderstood. When you say no one understands the book, I still don't really quite, what do you mean?
they don't understand. People, people interpret you often according to something about their own
Yes.
world, their own environment. They interpret the natural world in that way. In that context. So anything that I read, whether it's, Joy Luck Club or this particular book, people will always see that in the context also and in the assumptions they have about me. They will think about me more honorably than I am, or that I'm a wiser, nicer person than I am. They don't understand the reasons why I wrote something. So what people don't understand of each other are the true intentions and the little changes that we put out there as part of our public persona. And I'm not talking about the public persona on the stage, but just what we have in interactions with each other. So there's always going to be these little changes in how we represent what our intentions, motivations, and desires are. That, in that way, I will never be understood, and that I accept it. It's not, I don't have a loneliness in my life that I used to have, because I recognize, gosh, I kind of like myself and having these conversations, and I do it in a story, and I don't understand myself. How could I expect other people to? But I'm working on it. By doing the writing, I get to come closer to understanding myself.
It seems like the kind of human tendency to misinterpret, misunderstand one another, and the kind of impossibility of perfect fluency between two people is a subject of a lot of fiction. Can you kind of characterize for you, because we've sort of been broadly talking about writing and your writing, but as far as fiction goes, what the value of fiction is, as opposed to, let's say, we're living in a kind of reality-obsessed era, where there's even a trend against imaginative writing, and writing should be more, there's sort of memoir is more popular, but is there a value for you in the imaginative leap that fiction makes?
The value of what it is for me is going to be different from what I think the value of books are for the larger world, or, what I would hope you would get out of my particular books. My reasons for writing are very selfish. It is definitely not to help other Asian writers, jump the vault into the world of publishing. I'm really glad that happens. But I can't take credit for it. It wasn't my intention. I do think it is so important to have books out there because of the nature of imagination, and that because of the archetypes and the patterns that we share, the experiences, and for us to take those and to find commonality, but the differences, they are about human nature, our humanity. They are about using imagination to also have compassion for people. Compassion really is, by its very essence, the structure of compassion has to do with imagination. And so I think if we exercise imagination, we are doing better for ourselves as human beings. We have to be aware of other worlds. We have to be aware of Burma, what's happening in Burma, and why Aung San Suu Kyi is not the heroine, not deserving of the Nobel Prize. People don't understand that. They need to read a novel like yours to really understand not just the politics, but the humans behind the politics who are affected, who are being killed, who are, for generations being just... I'm getting, a little too dark, Debbie Downer here, but I'm just saying that we need books for so many reasons. And TV shows too, but we're in Hollywood. I thought I should mention that.
Ted, where are you? I just want to make sure since I lost. Okay, am I good on time here? Okay.
She lost her watch in the fire. Can you believe it?
That's why.
I know. I should give her my watch.
To return, you just mentioned patterns, and so I'm going to take that as an opportunity to return to one of the dominant patterns in this memoir and in your work in general, which is the mother figure, the grandmother. And one of the things to use a word I don't love to use when it related to, but also just really was touched by, was sort of the fluidity of roles in the mother-daughter relationships that you describe. For example, and also this is something that speaks to me quite a bit, the way that your mother even supposed that you might either be the reincarnation of her mother or sort of be channeling her mother. My own mother, when I was a toddler, performed a Burmese ritual to make me forget my past life because she was so convinced I was her mother. And but you also write about sort of the ferocity of your need when you were a teenager and you lost in the span of 12 months your brother and your father. Mm-hmm. The ferocity of your need to caretake and to stand up for your mother.
Yeah. Well, it was a mix of so many things. Losing my father, my brother, my older brother, the genius, and my father, 6 months apart, both of brain tumors, both, according to my mother, of a curse that would take us all, that would eventually kill us, which led my mother later to believe she might as well just kill me now so that, we didn't have to wait for the curse and she didn't have to see me ruin my life. This is all true, and I say that, it sounds really funny, but it is one of the structures of my life that have given me the way that I look at my relationships. What happened also at the time, I wanted to reject my mother, but I also needed to almost be symbiotic with her. That is what she needed to survive, to be alive. She wanted me to feel exactly what she felt. If she felt great despair and she could think of nothing else, she wanted me to feel the same. And I found that the only way I could handle what was left of our life was to keep my mother from killing herself. Mm-hmm. And so I did find myself, in almost a fictional way, imagining who she was and what she was feeling and then responding to that. So if she was angry at another person, I would assume the same anger and say, yes, that person had no right to say that. What do they understand of you? They never, and I would just mirror that back to her, which in a way was great, practice for fiction writing, because you have to be in that emotional, imaginative place. Mm-hmm. But I found for the rest of her life that I was constantly having to save her. Mm-hmm. There were times I resented it, and toward the end of her life, or toward the last third of her life, I loved taking care of her. My mother had Alzheimer's. I loved taking care of her as if she was a baby, and and making her feel safe and that she had no worries and that all the love she ever wanted was right there, and it had more to do with my realizing how much I understood of her. Now, so I'm not writing about mothers and daughters. I'm writing about me and my mother, my identity and how I think of myself and my mother's identity. Or this, identity is one of these terrible words. It's just a big, globby, flabby word that doesn't mean a lot. But the identity has within it that notion of misunderstanding and understanding of oneself and another person, your relationship, and all the threads that bind you to that person and the things that have been cut off. Mm-hmm. So yes, I'm fascinated in my relationship with my mother.
There's such a sweet line that I want to read that moved me. What you write about your mother at the end of her life, I found to be, my mother has passed away too, and I found it to be so moving. And this is after your mother is gone, and you imagine that if she were here, I would know all the ways I had misunderstood her, all the ways I could have known her, all the ways I could have told her that I knew what she had endured. You had endured suffering because of her, and yet that didn't obliterate your profound empathy for her, which is so moving.
I don't think that it obliterated my potential to empathize at all. I think it magnified it.
That's what I meant to say.
Because
that it
my
didn't
mother's
obliterate.
requirement to empathize, it was such a demand that I had to do it constantly. And yes, resented it sometimes, but then, I love that she made me the person that I am, and I would not. I think I say this in the book, that I would not want to go back and say, gee, I wish I had a happy childhood. I wish I had the kind of parents who encouraged me and pointed out that, attempting something was good enough. Or that my mother was a stable woman who didn't frighten me and tell me that if I kissed a boy, I would get pregnant and kill my baby. All of these things, all of those frights, all of those worries and expectations made me who I am. And I kind of like myself these days. So, because this is the person who writes, does the writing. And I enjoy my imagination. The ghoulish parts, the downer parts, all of it. I like the obsessions I have, which many of them are her obsessions. That particular line came out of my trying to trace back who my mother was according to her language patterns. My mother spoke no language perfectly. She spoke English to me, and sometimes I spoke baby Mandarin to her. She spoke Shanghainese, but it was with a Suzhou accent. She spoke baby Suzhou, so it was within those imperfections of her language, there was a history of who she was. And that's where I was looking at all the ways she had been misunderstood in these different languages. What would be the language we would have had where I could have understood everything about her? And it came from that desire. I mean, today I do have the desire still. I wish that I understood more what my mother meant or had wanted. And yet I feel very lucky that I had a mother who was so insistent that I know everything about what she meant, that I do know a great deal. The mother voices in the first book, The Joylet Club, were actually the ones that were easier to write than the daughters. They just came, I could just imagine very easily exactly how they would say something and why they would say it and the motivation. Because they had practiced it for so long.
You also mention, if I'm not incorrect, somewhere in the book, that your mother was pretty enthusiastic about your writing about her and gave you permission. And one time I was doing an academic interview. I was struggling with my novel, which is also based on my mother, and the person interviewing me said, who was a writer, what you were doing is absolutely impossible because we want to cleave to our mothers, and you can't cleave to your characters. And I think a smile came over my face, and I didn't say this, but I was thinking of the double meaning of cleave to, and cleave away from.
Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary to have the permission of one's family members in order to make that leap, make them characters, or is cleaving away from always a part of it?
I think we have responsibility, whether we're writing about family or culture or any subject. We have the freedom as writers to write what we want, yet that responsibility always remains there. And it goes back to what I said about intentions. We have to know what our intentions are whenever we write. If it's to write to expose something in our family and humiliate somebody who we hate, then I think that's a very bad intention for writing. But if we're writing something about a difficult matter that involves actual occurrences in a family, then we also have to think about how we treat that in a responsible, caring, loving manner. And if we take care to find the truth within that, I think it's fine. I had a cousin who was upset with me with one novel, The Valley of Amazement, because it suggested that our grandmother had been a courtesan. She certainly had been a concubine. But there are all kinds of reasons why it seemed that she might have been a courtesan. She did not want to raise this notion whatsoever. And what I found more important was to get rid of the myth that my grandmother had been an old-fashioned, quiet woman of little opinion who stayed at home and just cried. And I said, that wasn't my mother, and I'm influenced by my mother, and I'm certainly not that kind of person. My mother was a very strong woman of great opinion. And I'm sure that her mother was too. So I wanted to write about a woman who had a mind of her own. And in order to do that, I had to look at her in a different way than what my cousin wanted to look. She wanted to keep the myth. I will say, I need to say this about my mother because, I had a mother who spoke in broken English. She had an arranged marriage. She had this terrible life and this horrible first husband. My mother was a woman who told me I was not as good as a man when I was growing up at a very young age. She said I was better and that I had to never depend on a man. I always had to have the means to go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I could not be financially dependent on somebody because I would not have that freedom then. She also said that I had the freedom to decide whether I wanted to have children or not. And if I got pregnant and didn't want to have children, I could have an abortion because no one could tell me whether I should have children or not. Now that is a mother who, by any definition, I think today would be considered a feminist mother. I didn't think of her as a feminist mother. I thought of her as well as an intrusive mother for much of my life, impossible mother, but also a mother who gave me the sense that I was supposed to be independent, always to be independent, in thinking, in situation.
I think that's probably you, an independent woman, is the perfect way to end. I think we're going to open for questions now.
Yes, we indeed are. And just a quick reminder, at Live Talks Los Angeles, questions typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question, and only Charmaine Craig gets to ask follow-up questions. Who wants to go first?
Wow.
I'm trying to make this short now. Okay. What is your opinion on medication for basically mental stability and its impact on creativity if someone's going into the creative field of writing or anything else? And do you have any experience with that?
There are many things that affect the brain and mood, including one's own hormones or genetics. And so certainly when you put a chemical in your brain, you're going to alter parts of your brain. And it has to do with what parts and whether you do want to alter that. I have some experience with a drug called Lamictal, which I need to take for epilepsy. And I know a bit about how that has influenced my brain. In fact, it was a way that I discovered how much of our brains still contain these memories. This drug that I take for seizures ended up having the effect of making me laugh all the time. It made me have these visceral reactions to things where I'd see my dog wagging his tail, and then I'd get this warm, fuzzy, ticklish feeling in my chest. And that was a chemical reaction, but it was also something already in me, in this visceral part of us, which is also where PTSD memories reside. It has a similar pathway. I don't know whether that makes sense, but I'm just saying that, yes, I think any chemical will alter some part of your brain. And in my case, it allowed me to retrieve a lot of memories, emotional memories. I've never written anything on beer or wine. I think I would fall asleep or I'd misspell things more often than I already do. Same with marijuana or acid or cocaine or whatever. I've never done anything like that, any writing like that. I haven't done writing on Valium or coffee. That's about it. And then, drugs that I have to take. But I'm just more curious. Why would you ask a question? Because I didn't know whether you wanted a recommendation on a kind of drug to take. Let me just say I'm not offering any kind of recommendation because I don't think you want to have epilepsy to take this other kind of drug that I have to take, so.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, but I'll be vulnerable since I'm here. I watched your talk on creativity at a time a couple weeks back where for my anxiety and some panic in a big life I'm living, it was recommended that I try something more permanent. And I've yet to do that. And the biggest fear that I'm living with is that it would suppress creative expression and suppress ultimately reaching success that I'm out to achieve. So I was wondering your opinion on whether or not you've had any.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think success is completely separate from writing. Success is kind of an outcome often you can't control. Writing is something you would like to control, but sometimes it's good to not be in control because that desire to have control can sometimes constrict what you need to do with imagination or to let something freely come out. So if you feel that your mind is too anxious to allow you to write, then whatever makes you less anxious, I think, try it.
Amy, would you comment about this tremendous output on your Facebook wall of drawings you do? When did that start? and
I don't know. Has anybody seen this?
How long have you
these
been drawing
drawings
birds and animals?
When I was a little kid, I loved to draw, and I had an eye, what you call a good eye. And I loved to draw, and we moved once a year to a different school, and to impress the teachers, I would always draw something like a cat, and then I would become like a teacher's pet because I could draw. But when I was 16, at the end of my high school years, my art teacher said that I had admirable skills, but I lacked imagination necessary to go to a deeper creative level. So I gave up drawing. And it wasn't until recently, in fact, when the election results came in November 2016, I was so distraught, and I had to write one more chapter of this book, and I was so distraught about the future of many things. I just needed to think about beauty, and I started to draw birds. And I went to a class on nature journaling, and I started to draw every single day. And suddenly I had rediscovered this love I had of drawing. And I was like the little kid who was 6 years old, and I brought home my drawings from kindergarten and said, or 5, I guess, look, Mommy, Daddy, look what I did. And then they would put it up on the refrigerator with a magnet or something. And so Facebook is my refrigerator, and some of them aren't good, but I don't care. I don't make my living doing it. It's just to show this pleasure that I had in drawing a particular animal or a bird. It's not a person, it's always an animal. And I experiment with colors or something, and it doesn't come out well, but I'll still put it up there.
So you're not afraid of being public then with art, whereas with writing it's more...
No, nobody has any expectations. Nobody says, oh, that was published. It was a bad piece of art. However did she get that published? Well, it's not. It's my Facebook page. I could put anything I want up there, and you don't have to be there if you don't like my art. So that's what I do. But I will say this. We're at a particular age. I'm 66, and you start looking at bad things that can happen, diseases like memory loss that can happen as you get older. And I discovered that there are studies that artists have more padding in particular areas of their brain, more gray and white matter in an area called the precuneus in the parietal lobe, which is pretty much in the center of the brain. And that you could practice doing art and you can also get more of this padding in your brain. So I just think that drawing is giving me it's like a savings account. So that if I lose memory, I have a lot stored up. So drawing has that advantage as well.
It's like your muscle, but the
That's
genius
right.
muscle. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite meals, shared with your family growing up? Whether
Favorite
dishes that you ate.
Oh,
whether
dishes.
Your mom made it, or if you went out, or any
Yeah.
dishes that you remember that was a nostalgic moment.
My mother was such an amazing cook that it is the reason why I have been, I've given up ever trying to cook anything. I can hear, when I said I can imagine everything she would say. I can imagine her saying, as I cook it, oh no, you shouldn't do that. Oh, too long. Now it's no longer tender. She was an amazing cook. So the kind of dishes that I loved are a home cooking that you would never see in a Chinese restaurant. The yellow soybean heads, they're just those yellow, and that's just sautéed very cleanly, very quickly. Everything is still very tender. Or cabbage. You don't see that I saw it in one Chinese restaurant. A friend took me to a restaurant in Southern California that had this. I was so surprised. She made jiaozi, guotie, pot stickers. And it always had to be, the skins had to be a certain thickness, not too thick, and not so thin that when you put it in the boiling water or in the pan that they'd fall apart and that all the juices would go out. She would make crab, which I actually did not like. But she made crab in a really terrible way. She would put them she would buy live crabs in Chinatown, and she put them in a pot, a big pot with water, and turn the heat on, then she'd walk away. And I would hear these, claws against the side of the pot, and I would just be there. Oh, I thought she did that because it made them more tender. And she told me later, no, she just didn't want to see them die. So I was the one left to see. So I didn't like crab. I loved a dish called hogo, which is a hot pot, and you just throw things in. It's like fishing later on. You take like fondue, only, with a broth and noodles and different things. So many dishes. And I'm just naming the ones some of the things that I don't see at restaurants, that were just the simple, clean cook kind of foods. She was Shanghainese, and it's called clean cook. Very little in the way of sauces.
Here in the back.
Hi, I was just wondering kind of how or when was it that you realized that you were a writer? How did that happen? Or, what was that experience that made you know?
I don't know if I ever had a feeling I was a writer when I was young. I was astonished to find that people thought I was a writer when I started to write fiction. I knew that I could write well enough to do business writing, for example. I knew that in college that if I took a course that required me to write as opposed to knowing facts that had to be memorized, I would do well. I knew I could bullshit my way out of anything as long as I could write it. But I didn't know that I was a fiction writer until people started commenting on my writing. I didn't know that I could become a fiction writer as my main endeavor in life until I was published. And I still did not believe that I would remain this published writer the rest of my life. I truly believe, and you can ask my husband this, who's in this audience, that I kept preparing myself for this to go away. When my first book was published, even up until it was published in March, and even until October, I was saying this is going to go away, and I'm going to go back to the business writing. This is going to go away. And because this was nothing I had ever asked for or dreamed of. It was just handed to me. And there are times, too, I find it astonishing that I can write what I consider to be garbage, and people think it's great, you know. I'm not trying to be modest in that Chinese humility way where you come back and you tell me, no, it's really good, you know, because I've just said, this is truly how I feel about the writing, that it's not good enough, you know, that I could have done better.
2 more questions?
Hi, I'm over here. This is really crazy, actually, because I read one of your pieces in school, and we actually studied something that you wrote. It was, I think, a piece of one of your writings called Two Kinds. Oh. And I just want to say that that was one of those pieces that we read in class, and I think everyone knows that it's hard to get a group of teenagers to pay attention. But after we read this piece of yours, we all just kind of sat in shock and wondered what genius wrote this. And I just want to say that I know that you probably, you know, were like, oh, it just happened. But for me, that was really fascinating and really fantastic. And I wanted to ask, there was a song in that story that you played on the piano, and it was kind of about there's two separate...
It's Schumann. It's from Scenes from Childhood. And the song is, they're not the same song. There's not 2 halves of the song, but they happen to be on opposite pages. And I'm sure that he must have written them, Schumann must have written them around the same time, all of these pieces. One's called Perfectly Contented, and the other was Pleading Child. And I always imagine, you know, when I hear this music, for example, Pleading Child, I imagine this whiny child, you know, why can't I do this, or I never get love, and then there's Perfectly Contented, and, you know, everything is gone exactly as the child would want. And that was the story here, Two Kinds, of a child who is always in this flux and wanting to find herself in a place where she was perfectly contented, which is, of course, impossible. But finding it as an adult, this had been what she was seeking, that emotion, that recognition.
So my question to you is, do you still think of that song to this day? Like, do you still kind of sometimes...
I have many, you know, not on a daily basis, not on a particular one, but what I have, however, is that sense of duality and contradiction always in my life. I'm looking at it. One thing I allow in myself, people always think that you have to be firm in your opinions and how you look at life. And I like the notion that you can be contradictory. And I allow myself that. I allow myself to be simultaneously perfectly contented and also the pleading child who's worried, you know, to occupy both of those structures in my brain. So in that way, the song is always with me.
And our final question for the evening?
Better be good. It's the last one, and don't make it a downer. Don't ask me why all my male characters are bad role models or something.
I just wanted to ask what you would suggest in terms of creative resistance in the age of Trump.
Creative resistance in the age of Trump. Well, I would never say anything bad about 45. No, you should go to my Facebook page. Boy, you could see all the trolls come out and the bots. I saw this afternoon the movie The Post, and it was, this attempt to suppress the press during a time when it came out that a lot about the war had been suppressed. And I came out of that saying to myself, yes, it is so good to be a writer because we need to tell what's been hidden. We need to come out and say it a million different ways, a million different times. And that's what we have to do in writing it. We have to express opinions. I express these opinions on my Facebook page. I have a public page and I have a private page. The private page are people I actually have dinner with or I've known for most of my life. And the public page are people who are friends, but I don't know them face to face. And every now and then I'll write something about 45. And I have people who say, I used to love reading your books, but now, I see that you are really stupid and you have no right to write these things. I shouldn't have to read this. You should just do what you do best. And I thought, what do I do best? Do I do best by not having any thoughts and opinions in my head? And when they say, and I'll never buy another book of yours, and I just want to laugh, And so I put that on there. I just say, please throw my books out. I really don't want them to be occupying a place in your house. If you think a writer has no opinions, I don't know what you're reading, It's so even if you're a fiction writer, you have opinions. You may not think that you're writing politics, but everything about our life is governed by a certain level of politics. And so when you write even about daily life, write about human nature, it has politics in it. Your views and how the outer world is impressing itself on you and how you conduct your life. So right away, we need to have people just keep writing and stating their opinions in public, on social media, but also in a much more revised and considered form. If you do read my Facebook posts or Twitter or whatever it is, please understand, I write these things on my iPhone and I don't reread them. And you're probably thinking, how the hell did she get published? Because she can't even write a decent sentence. And that's why. I'm just lazy and I make a lot of typos. But I write spontaneously the things that I feel at the moment. There'll be a lot of pictures on my Facebook page, but also these opinions that I have about what's happening to our country. And I'm not going back to China, I'm sorry to say.